Hi everyone who is watching this video. This is Political Capital's video interview with Radosław Sikorski, who is the former Foreign Minister of Poland and right now member of the European Parliament. He is the member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs, and also he is the chair of the Delegation for Relations with the United States. Before his long academic career, Mr. Sikorski worked as a journalist, and he was included on the list of top 100 global thinkers 2012, published by Foreign Policy magazine. Mr. Sikorski, welcome to this interview.
Hello.
2 weeks ago, we published a report at Political Capital Institute called Authoritarian Shadows in the European Union that is available on our website. And today's discussion in line with this study will be around this issue, malign influence in the European Union and the EU's foreign policy response to this challenge. Political Capital have invented a methodology that allows us to measure and quantify openness to authoritarian influence and reluctance to counter this influence from the level of MEPs to the level of the whole European Parliament. We also prepared individual MEP profiles in Central Eastern European, on Central Eastern European MEPs, and based on our methodology, Mr. Sikorski is a member of the European Parliament that received an outstanding rating according to our points, a maximal Kremlin critical index, because he supported all the resolutions that we collected in the current European parliamentary term that were critical towards Russia and supporting the efforts to countering Russian interference. And also he received a maximum counter-authoritarian critical index due to his support to other resolutions targeting other authoritarian regimes such as China, but also Cuba and Venezuela. So my first question would be how do you see the role of the European Union as a whole and European Parliament in particular in countering authoritarian influences? What we found in the study is that the European Parliament seems to be more resistant than the member states in general. Would you share this optimistic view?
Well, I think as the legislative branch, we should do at the European level what parliaments do or should do at the national level, which is to be the conscience and the supervision of executive power. By virtue of drawing our authority directly from the people who elect us, we have greater independence than people who have to deal with non-democratic government on a daily basis. You know, I've served in the administration, I've been minister, and as a minister, of course, you have to deal with North Korea or Venezuela or Saudi Arabia, which are not democracies. And you can't always say what you think. But as a member of parliament, representing the values of the democratic community that elected you, you have much more leeway. And that's the liberty that I use. There are some authoritarian influences in the European Parliament. Just to give you an example, last week I was in Brussels and we had a debate on the poisoning of Alexei Navalny. And to my astonishment, members of Parliament from the extreme right and from the extreme left, as you would expect, were saying, well, how do we know that it was Mr. Putin who did it? It was the Russians. We shouldn't be pronouncing on this without having proof. You know, when Novichok is a military-grade substance invented and controlled by the Russian government, and to my mind, using it was like leaving a visiting card. It was designed so that everybody would know that the Russian government did it, so as to intimidate the Russian opposition not to follow the example of Belarus. And yet there were people who thought this was too far. I mean, they may just have views like that, or they may be living in a any information silos in which such views are widespread. But that's influence too.
Yeah, I think it's a very important point. What we found in our study is exactly what you have said, is that the radical left and the radical right are the most vulnerable to foreign authoritarian influence, and we find the most arguments that are relativizing all the human rights abuses and foreign interference that Kremlin does are on the radical left and on the radical right. What do you think? What kind of political or institutional changes would you propose to strengthen the immunity, either in the European Parliament or in the whole European Union as a whole? So this is a very complex institutional system with many entries and with no obvious persons who are taking care of everything. So there are multiple stakeholders, and these kind of complex institutions are usually easier to be partially influenced by outside. What do you think that the EU can do to strengthen its immunity?
Well, first of all, we are at the European level a democracy. So people are allowed to have pro-authoritarian views, and our people have the right to elect such politicians. If that's what they think, I regret it, but that's freedom. But what we can do something about is, for example, the way we select advisors and staff members for members of parliament. I was very surprised that there aren't any counterintelligence procedures in the European Parliament. That people who have nationalities of citizenship of authoritarian states can serve in advisory roles to members of parliaments and even to sensitive committees such as defense and foreign affairs, and that these advisors do not go through the kind of vetting procedure that we would regard as elementary in our national systems. So I think we need some sensible precautions. People need to lodge their CVs, they need to answer some basic questions. And then, as regards members themselves, there aren't procedures, to my knowledge, as to access to EU documentation. You have to go to a protected room in order to read some of the classified information, but there isn't any procedure to give you access to those documents. And I think maybe there should be, because not everybody should be allowed to read everything. And then, I mean, you know, I meet ambassadors from all over the place, including from countries that we wouldn't regard democracies, but I think that is legitimate. Ambassadors in Brussels are there to represent their countries, whatever their political system, and any sensible MEP who meets with them can ask the Parliamentary Research Service or their political group for a briefing, what kinds of things, well, about the nature of the government, but also the kinds of interests that such governments have towards the European Union. And you have to engage in dialogue with people you disagree with. I think that's within certain bounds, that's legitimate.
You, with your fellow MEPs and some other politicians, have just written an opinion piece that appeared today in Le Monde and Handelsblatt, in which you write, Europe should make clear to China that if it moves towards the use of force, it would risk an economic and political rupture with Europe's democracies. So it would be your message to the current EU-China summit, and could you elaborate a bit on this point?
Well, China is a great and serious country that deserves respect. But equally, China has made commitments on the international scene in treaty form by being a member of the United Nations, by being a member of the World Trade Organization and others, to respect certain norms. And all we require of China is to respect what China herself has signed up to. And one of the principles of the United Nations is the principle of not changing borders by force, the integrity of states. And so while we don't want to get involved in the China-US rivalry for primacy in the world, and while we have important economic interests with China, I believe Europe should be an honest, give honest warnings about what will happen if China uses force. We think it would be highly regrettable, and that's why we also think it's a mistake to snuff out the political declaration with Britain, because if you convince the Taiwanese that that one country, two systems is not viable and will not be respected, then you are reducing your chances for peaceful unification, which of course is a dangerous development. So without overestimating our influence on China, I believe that we have enough standing to tell China like it is, to express our worries about their trajectory.
Thank you. What do you think are generally, if we can talk about something like that, the biggest successes and the biggest failures of EU foreign policy in the last few years?
Well, the creation of the External Action Service was not an easy task. And the fact that it now exists and functions and produces sometimes interesting material and position papers and gives guidance to member states was of course a success. There were some early successes that we should have promoted better with our public, like the strike on Somali pirates in the Horn of Africa, when we used kinetic force. Lady Ashton, from the Situation Room, ordered a military strike, as a result of which the incidence of piracy went down for a number of years. We got the Serbia-Kosovo dialogue going. And the Iran deal, I mean, we know where it is now, but the fact that we got it in the first place was largely the work of European diplomacy. So there are some successes, but the problem is that member states have ceased to be serious about doing foreign policy together. So I don't want to engage in this classic blame game of blaming the EU or its particular services for what the member states are not allowing them to do. Because the Lisbon Treaty is crystal clear that national interests should be expressed and bargained and horse-traded at the Foreign Affairs Council. We should be coming to a consensus at the Foreign Affairs Council, and then the High Representative and the President of the Council should be representing and carrying out the agreed policy with loyal support of the member states. That's what the treaty says. And the member states are in breach of the treaty because they sort of agree policy, actually using vetoes, in unrelated fields to lower the common denominator, and then they freelance with the United States, with Russia, with China, you name it, on their own anyway. Well, that is not a recipe for effectiveness. And then they complain that the EU is not effective. This is not serious, and I just wish the member states would do what the treaty says, which is, you know, whether on Ukraine or on Russia or on China or on Venezuela, withdraw, say, from the Minsk process or from the Normandy process, and say to our international partners, we've done what we could, we've now agreed a position, now you talk to our high representative who will represent all of the EU in the matter at hand. And then I think we would all benefit.
Yeah, I think it's very important to raise as well that such kind of EU foreign policy that is coordinated among the member states would, according to most of the polls done by not only Eurobarometer, but several other pollsters, it would enjoy the support of the overwhelming majority of the European voters who would be happy to put more powers in terms of foreign policy in the hands of EU institutions. As I already mentioned, one of the findings of our study is that European institutions, even if they are complicated, are less vulnerable to authoritarian influence than the member states themselves. And usually the influence of the authoritarian regimes is rather exerted through the member states and less in the European Union. How do you see this situation when it comes to your country, Poland? The Polish government is often mentioned as one that, despite having some authoritarian tendencies, at least it stands up strongly against authoritarian influence, especially against the Kremlin, but also against Chinese influence and so on. Would you share this view?
Well, I think Poland, the best thing that Poland can do for democrats and freedom fighters around the world is to itself give a good example of a successful transformation from authoritarianism and the command economy to a democracy and the free market. And that's what we were doing until quite recently. In addition, the policy of successive Polish governments was to make Warsaw a kind of pro-democracy hub. That's why we hosted in Warsaw the seat of ODIHR, the arm of the OSCE responsible for monitoring the honesty of elections around the world. That's why we hosted the Community of Democracies. That's why we granted €1 million Solidarity Prize. That's why we've created the Polish International Solidarity Foundation. That's why I proposed the creation of the European Endowment for Democracy. That's why we have a radio Racja that broadcasts from Eastern Poland to Belarus, and TV Bielsat that broadcasts also to Belarus, and so on and so on. So first of all, Poland is not maximizing its potential when it itself is under criticism for the quality of its elections or for the quality of its rule of law, when a Polish government breaks its own constitution and European treaties and is under threat of sanctions in the European Union on law and order issues. But it's true that the nationalist Polish government is verbally very anti-Putin. But one wonders what really suits President Putin. The kind of Poland that is orally and vocally anti-Putin, but is isolated in the EU and therefore not capable leading Europe's Eastern policy, or the kind of Poland which was less extreme in its rhetoric, but was therefore regarded as an expert on Eastern affairs, and therefore was capable of persuading all of the EU to create Eastern Partnership, for example, or to organize a mediation of European foreign ministers to the Maidan in 2014. Today's Polish government wouldn't be capable of either of these things. So I suspect that President Putin is happier with the kind of anti-Russian but less influential Poland that he has today. Plus, I suspect that our Russian friends are, well, I don't suspect, I know that they've for decades been very good at recruiting people under a false flag. So there may be Polish politicians who think that they are in touch with the deep state in the United States or somewhere else, and that they serve a right-wing cause, which in fact is controlled from Moscow. And I suspect there is some of that going on, because I detect a certain naivete among our politicians and media who think that because Poland has struggled with Russian domination for so long, we are immune to it. But what the Russians do is much more sophisticated than just praising the attractiveness of Russia. Russian game is sowing division and extremism, and they don't care whether it's pro-Russian or anti-Russian, as long as it weakens the victim of such actions. And the divisions in Poland have never been greater, whether it's over the Smolensk tragedy or gay rights or attitudes to Donald Trump or attitudes to Russia. Polish society has been successfully split into two political tribes.
Thank you. And my last question would be about the European People's Party and your party family, the center-right group in the European Parliament. And because on the one hand, what we could see in our figures is the European People's Party is the party that stands up this, most strongly against the influence of the Kremlin and criticizes the decisions of Vladimir Putin and his regime with many resolutions initiated and supported. And at the same time, with Renew Europe, European People's Party is the group that is the most critical against authoritarian influence in general as well. On the other hand, at the discussion we had about 2 weeks ago with other members of the European Parliament, some questions were raised about the democratic track record of the European People's Party when dealing with these issues such as Alexander Vucic's authoritarian adventures in Serbia, or also to talk about a European state as well, member of the European Union, Hungary's European track record. And as the criticism says, the European People's Party is not strong enough in condemning the authoritarian tendencies of its own members. What do you think about that?
Well, I don't know about Serbia, but Hungary is a subject of lively discussion inside the EPP. And there are some regional differences. You know, the Northerners, the Scandinavian countries are more critical. The South tends to be somewhat less, with Germany somewhere in the middle. I can tell you personally, Viktor Orban, who went to my college at Oxford on a Soros scholarship, and whom I used to count as a friend, lost me when he closed down Central European University. You know, people should be allowed to have different views at universities. And first of all, it's not a lefty university, and I know it's chairman, a liberal conservative Canadian, So to talk about it as some kind of lefty institution is first of all wrong. But even if it were, lefties are allowed to teach at universities, and we should have a system which allows for plurality. And I don't think that we should tolerate a movement which tries to create some kind of fantasy traditionalist past that never in fact existed, which is what I see Fidesz and PiS in Poland having as a goal. You know, they think they're creating Bavaria, but actually what may come out is Slovakia under Father Tiso or Portugal under Salazar. And that is not what EPP should be supporting or tolerating. And from my point of view, when we talk to our Hungarian colleagues from EPP, they seem to me to be mentally already with the nationalists in the European Parliament and not with EPP. Institutionally, this hasn't happened yet, but I would guess it's a foregone conclusion. So let's do it with the least aggro, but EPP is not a nationalist party. We believe in Europe, and we believe in coexistence and pooling sovereignty, and not in this right-wing fantasy. So I think our ways will sooner or later part.
I think this issue will be the topic of many discussions within the European People's Party in the future as well. So, Mr. Sikorski, thank you very much for being available for this interview, and hope to see you next time as well.
Thank you. My pleasure.